Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched Shadow and Bone on Netflix. Let's talk about it. So Shadow and Bone is a Netflix series that is based off of the fantasy novel series that was written by Lee Bardugo. Now apparently this series is incredibly popular, okay? It's very much hip and hopping amongst the kids these days because a lot of people were really excited to see this series when Netflix came out with the trailer. And so I decided to hop on the bandwagon. But when it comes to Netflix, I have to say that these days is like a 50% chance that if I'm going to sit here and talk about a Netflix series, either I'm going to have a frown on my face, a look of disgust on my face, a look of agony, just constant suffering and pain from what Netflix pushes out every week, or I'm going to be sitting here with a bit of a smile, with a bit of a, in a good mood, okay? And I have to say on this instance, I'm smiling because I had a fun time with this show. Let's go through my thoughts on this series because I have plenty of them. But before we do so, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. But without further ado, let's get into this. So like I said, I actually ended up enjoying this series quite a bit, even though I can definitely see some of its faults and flaws, and we're definitely going to be diving into those later on in this review. But first and foremost, like just from the onset, as soon as the series started, I could see that it was a level up from the usual riffraff that Netflix throws at us. I mean, at this point in time, they have had many attempts to enter the fantasy genre and occupy a space of, say, Game of Thrones. I have seen the comparisons already being made with this series against Game of Thrones, and we're going to be discussing that throughout this review. But let me just say straight up, okay, Game of Thrones was a very special time in our culture. Game of Thrones was a very special, specific moment. It's not something that can just be replicated easily by the next new fantasy series. It was a very specific thing, and the way that it went out was also tremendously specific. So I have to say that the constant Game of Thrones comparisons, it gets clicks, okay? It gets viewership. But at the same time, for this series, I do think that that comparison is unwarranted. It is unfair because for it to automatically be compared to something like Game of Thrones, I mean, it kind of sets up the audience for disappointment basically because it's nowhere near that level. I do think that the series is once again a leg up from the usual Netflix fare, like your Cursed, like your A Letter for the King, like your The Irregulars, which we saw a few weeks ago. First of all, the production value is palpably, more expensive, more well done. It feels grander, which I appreciated a lot. I also think that the performances here are a leg up from what we usually see from Netflix, with the actors actually doing some actoring. In terms of the overall cast, I do think that they are stronger. I do think that the characters that they bring to life do have a little bit more energy to them, a little bit more likability and memorability to them. But one thing that really struck me as something quite unique about this series in particular is actually the backdrop of the series being more akin to Russian law, Russian history and literature, as opposed to the usual fare that we see within the fantasy genre, where they tend to take a lot of references and historical context from British history and from like English law and culture and literature. I mean, we've often seen time and time again that when it comes to these fantasy series, the backdrop tends to be medieval England or the Dark Ages, leading right up until even the Tudor period and even beyond that. You see, for example, in the case of George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, that there were a lot of influences from the War of the Roses and that kind of era of British history. So I feel like it was a nice change to see that actually this series was very much inspired by Russia and Russian culture and literature and history. We see this in many different ways. For example, with the costuming, the names of these characters like Alina Starkov, and also you have the royal family themselves in this series, which very much echo that of the family of the Romanovs, as well as the king's trusted spiritual advisor who is giving me strong Rasputin vibes. Like, as soon as he entered the room, I was like, oh, I know a Rasputin when I see one. So I enjoy the fact that this series takes a different approach when it comes to having this fantasy backdrop being set in a kind of different version of Russia. And there are other cultures and other parts of Europe that are explored in different pockets of this universe, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, I do think it was a nice point of distinction, and I did read that that was something that was intentionally included in the books to kind of make it feel more distinct in comparison to all of the other fare that we see within the fantasy genre that tend to be based off of British history. But since we're already talking about the backdrop of this series, I wanted to kind of touch on my thoughts on the world building here, because I think it's effective, but to a certain extent. I do think they do a good job of kind of integrating the lore of magic and of, you know, these Grecias, these kind of witches who have these particular powers. They do a good job of explaining why, even though these are incredibly powerful beings, they are kind of marginalized in society and kind of looked down upon and discriminated against in society because of the fold, that's what it's called, the fold situation, and other people not trusting the Grecians as a result of that. So I do think they did a good job of building that story up, and then when it reaches its crescendo and we realize that actually it's Ben Barnes' character who was the creator of the fold to begin with, the fold, I think it's the fold. I do think they did a good job on that story element, and I do think that building the world and kind of explaining the role of the Grecians here was very well done. However, when it comes to the other pockets of the world and of Ravka, is it called? I always struggle when it comes to fantasy series with the names and the characters. Like, there are always so many characters, so many different magics and laws and creatures. I always struggle with that. But anyways, when it comes to the rest of the Ravka and like the rest of the countries surrounding this fold situation, I do think they could have done a better job of making them feel a little bit more distinct. That's one thing that I always look for when it comes to, you know, series or films that try to build a world with different pockets in it. I do want each of these pockets to feel distinct and unique. It also makes it very easy to tell like what culture you're referring to. Like when you have a Game of Thrones, for example, you can tell when you're in Winterfell versus when you're in King's Landing or in Essos or wherever. Like, they do feel very distinct as places and as cultures, and I feel like that was kind of lacking here. Again, the geography of these places might be completely different, and that might be why. At the end of the day, when you're dealing with a fantasy series, the more imagination, okay, the more world building, the better. And I feel like when it came to this series, oftentimes we were stuck in very similar environments, whether they be in these, you know, war camps or inside of the palace. It was a missed opportunity on that front. Also, one of the major reasons why I think that the Game of Thrones comparisons are completely unfair, unwarranted, if I'm being honest, it's because Game of Thrones was just on a whole other level when it came to world building, not only just aesthetically and culturally in these different pockets of Westeros, but also when it came to the political angle. The politics of these worlds was so complex, it was so well built, and again, it drew upon historical references from real life. It was just this web of different political figures and parties and interested parties, and it was just something that we had to unravel as the seasons went on, and that was part of the intrigue surrounding Game of Thrones, especially for viewers like me who were never really attracted to the fantasy angle, the magic angle to begin with. I got into Game of Thrones because of the political intrigue of it all, and so that very much plays second fiddle to the magical aspects of this series. And I would say, you know, that's fine. Like, that's fine if that's what they want to do, but that's why I feel like the Game of Thrones comparisons, like, they don't, I'm so sorry, but it's not fair to the show because they're doing two different things here. When it comes to the politics of Ravka, is that the country? I don't know. When it comes to the politics of Ravka, they're pretty plain and simple for the most part, and especially when you get down to the second half of the series, everything is kind of boiled down to good versus evil. You do have some of these kind of grey area parties like the separatists who want a separate kind of West Ravka, I believe, and then you also have, of course, you know, Kaz and his lot who are kind of bad guys, but they're like lovable rogues. So we kind of like enjoy their angle of the story. And then we have Matthias and Nina who are kind of in their own little pocket situation with their love story, but overall it's not overly complex, okay? It's not like this web of lies and political intrigue that we're really diving into as the episodes go on. It's pretty simplified, especially when you get to the second half, we start to see that a lot of the potential that this series had to build that kind of complex world isn't going to be met. Alright, so now let's get into some of these characters. And first one up, of course, we have Alina Starkov herself. She is the chosen one of the show. She is the sun summoner, okay? She has this very unique set of skills. A very unique set of skills, which makes her incredibly unique even within the Grisha community. Now, she wasn't tested as a child as other Grisha are because she didn't want to be separated from her friend Mal, who we'll talk about in a second. But she finds out that she has these special powers when they go about this expedition on this new kind of boat that is supposed to be able to go through the fold. And in the end, of course, it doesn't really work out, and she ends up, being able to save Mal with these newly discovered powers. But she's quickly swept away by the Shadow Man, Ben Barnes himself. And she ends up going to the Little Palace where she's going to be trained to use these sun summoning powers to rescue the whole of Ravka, because she's the only one who can get rid of the fold. Also, she thinks. Now, when it comes to the character of Melina, I think that in her case, she very much is aligned with the usual female protagonists that we see in these Netflix series. I don't know if they're making them in like a factory or something. Like, they're all starting to blend into one another. Like, it's just, there's nothing unique about this character at all. I'm so sorry. She's like pleasant, like she's fine. There's nothing offensively bad about her. Not like that character from The Irregulars, who I absolutely hated. The chosen one there was just unbearable. Oh, I really didn't like her. But when it comes to Alina, like, she's fine. More bearable in the first half. In the second half, she just becomes an open mouth breathing, shocked looking mess, and it's kind of disappointing if I'm being honest. But yeah, overall, she's being pumped out of the Netflix female protagonist factory, and there's nothing really remarkable about her. I will say as well, there is this kind of angle when it comes to this character where she is of the Shu people, like she's half Shu, and I feel like that's like a lot of racial coding. Like, I'm not sure what they were trying to do there, because clearly it was supposed to be a reference to this in-world racism that exists and this kind of classism that exists. But because the cast, generally speaking, is quite diverse, and we see diverse populations in each of the pockets of these worlds, it's difficult to make sense of the race hierarchy structure. Because it would make more sense if, for example, we have a King's Landing where we see the different types of people that live there versus the people that live in Essos versus the people that live in like these sandy desert areas. I can't remember all of the names now. But basically in Game of Thrones you can see the different phenotypes, okay, the different genetics of these people who come from these different areas, whereas in the case of Shadow and Bone, it's kind of like a melting pot all around. So how can you make sense of the kind of racial hierarchy when when everyone just seems to be mingling together? And so people are like, yeah, she looks like a Shu, and I'm like, but you're black. I don't understand. I don't understand who has like the upper hand here. And also, what does looking like a Shu look like? Because Ben Barnes looks relatively similar to Alina, so I'm like, what's differentiating her from being a Shu? Is it because like she's like half Asian? Is that why? But then there are Asian people in this world as well. Like, they're not referred to as Shu. I don't know. I don't know what the racial hierarchy is in this series, is what I'm saying. And so I feel like the commentary, the social commentary, if it was even supposed to be that, kind of falls flat on that basis. Next up, we have Malin, aka Mal, who is Alina's longtime childhood friend. He's always been there for her. I mean, they've grown up together in these impoverished circumstances, and they meet up here, on the camps during this war, with Alina being this kind of cartographer, I believe it was. Yeah, it was a cartographer. And Mal is a fighter. He's a soldier in the first army, I believe it is. It's the second army. I'm trying to figure this out. It's the second army who have the Grishas. The first army are just like regular people, I'm guessing. I'm guessing it was a way to kind of, knock down the Grishas a peg by making them the second army, even though they seem to be more powerful than the first army. But when it comes to Mal's kind of role in this story, I do think that they did a pretty good job of establishing the relationship that Alina and Mal have, and making us understand how they've always kind of lent on each other, even though Mal hasn't always been able to see Alina for the special, the chosen one that she is. But I do feel like overall, when it comes to Mal, there's nothing much of his character aside from his relationship with Alina. I mean, in this kind of cruel twist, we have a male love interest who really is nothing but a love interest. Aside from, you know, his relationship with Alina, there's not much there. Like, he doesn't have a story of his own. And so his whole story seems to be wrapped up on trying to find Alina, trying to save her from Ben Barnes, and trying to kind of rescue her from his clutches. Maybe that will change in like a second series. But overall, yeah, that's pretty much, again, another male love interest that's kind of been pumped out of the Netflix factory at this point. But he is very likable. I think the actor does a good job in portraying this character. He's a likable male love interest, but he's also like, yeah, you're there. And also, he proves to be more useful than Alina in a lot of circumstances. I don't know what that's about. Is he a Grisha too? Because they keep calling him a tracker, but I think he's just like a professional tracker or something. Anyways, I don't know. But he seems more useful. Like, why is it that this guy with a gun is more useful than this girl with like sun summoning powers? That really frustrated me, especially at the end of the series. Like, yes, she was forced to share her powers with Ben Barnes. We'll talk about him in a second. And so that kind of made her useless. But there are so many scenes where Mal is fighting, like he's going up against these other Grishas, these heart renderers or whatever, and she's just standing there like, oh no, I'm stuck because of a rope. Like, just pull the rope, like break the rope somehow. Like, it's really not that deep. Why is he doing more than you and you're supposed to be the chosen one? Anyway, so next we have Ben Barnes, aka Alexander, aka the Shadow Man, whatever you want to call him. He was fun. Like, he was having a good time. He was fun here. Listen, I remember when Ben Barnes was a thing. I remember when he was hip and hopping himself, okay, earlier in like the late 2000s, because of his, I guess, resemblance to Orlando Bloom, who was also a thing. And you had him, you know, appearing in like Narnia and Dorian Gray and stuff like that. Like, he very much had a moment. And so seeing him here and almost looking pretty much identical to the way he did 10 years ago was actually quite a trip. But yeah, I think he had fun on this series. I feel like he's the perfect age for the character that he's portraying. But at the same time, it is a bit like weird because we have Alina, who's supposed to be that weird kind of Netflix age where you're supposed to kind of be a teenager, but you can't really be a teenager. So you're somewhere in the early 20s kind of age group. It was kind of weird seeing him start this relationship with her. Like, it was giving me icky vibes, okay? Although that was, of course, the intent, because it turns out he just wanted to drain her of her powers. But yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. Like, in those beginning scenes, I was like, okay, this is a bit, it's a bit interesting, a bit weird. But what really disappointed me about this character, and I was literally talking about this recently when I was reviewing Falcon and the Winter Soldier, was that, you know, when the big reveal comes out, it turns out that he is the bad guy. He was the one who made the fold in the first place, which, why did no one else think of it? I guess because he's like a mortal, so no one thought that he would be the one to have made it in the first place. But he has the shadow power. The fact that they made the guy with the shadow powers the head of the army that's supposed to, you know, tackle a lot of the issues that are a result of the shadow place, the fold, is crazy to me. That makes no sense. Like, literally hire anyone else. Was there no one? I guess they wanted a sun summoner. I guess that's the problem. Yes, it turns out that he is the bad guy. And what disappointed me about the character is initially they attempted to make him feel a little bit more complex, okay? A little bit more layered. We get an understanding of where he's coming from. It does kind of not make sense how the Grisha kind of looked down upon and trodden on, even though they are like powerful beings, okay? It makes sense that he would feel like his people are being let down by everyone else and he wants, I guess, supremacy over everyone else because he is a supremacist. That's what makes him evil. And also the fact that he ended up making life worse for his own people anyways when he created the fold, because a lot of the monsters that you see lurking in the darkness were previously Grisha themselves. So I do like the way that they tried to kind of attempt to make him a more complex character, but by the end there was none of that. By the end, and there's this like particular moment where Ben Barnes looks in camera and says, fine, make me the bad guy. And it's at that moment where I was like, okay, all complexity is lost. To be fair, we had already started to lose any hope of him being a complex character when he straight up killed that stag. Like, as soon as he's killing animals, we already know he's evil for sure, okay? Just completely irredeemable. But when he literally or almost looked in camera and said, fine, make me the villain, I was like, okay. So from here on out, there's no pretenses anymore. There's no shades of grey, it's just black. It's just darkness. And very much literally too, because by the end of the series we see that he gets eaten up by like one of his own monsters, but because he's immortal and because we didn't see the body burn, we do see him at the very end there just kind of struggling, limping out of the fold, and we do see his shadows, his shadow creations following him. And I will say that imagery, excellent. I wish we got more of that kind of iconography. It was beautifully done. Him just kind of walking out of the fold, like limping out of the fold, and then he just says follow, and it follows it. That was love. Mwah. Compliments to the chef there. That was very well done. But yes, he's the bad guy, and I think, you know, in the second season when we see him return, there will be less shades of grey. There will just be darkness. So next up, we need to talk about, of course, Kaz and his gang with Inej and Jesper. Now, when it came to these characters, I had some mixed thoughts, okay? Overall, I did enjoy the actors' performances. I thought they were very charismatic, very enjoyable to watch. But to me, the issue when it comes to this little gang is more to do with the story and the plot. But if I was to rank these three characters, first of all, right on top, we have Inej. Okay, oftentimes she felt like the only one who had actually read the assignment. And I'm not talking about the mission, okay? I'm not talking about their little deal to get 1 million Kruger. That's not the assignment that I'm talking about. I'm talking about gaining perspective over the worlds that they were living in as a whole. Because it seemed to me that was one of the major issues when it came to this little, you know, storyline with these characters, because it seems to me that it made absolutely no sense for a character like Kaz to completely overlook the stakes, like what was really at stake here, because it wasn't just about making a quick buck. This was literally about whether or not they were going to help save the day, like save the whole world, because by kidnapping the Sun Summoner, they would potentially get rid of the only person who could get rid of the fold. And I understand Kaz is greedy, okay, he has his own interests and motivations, but surely getting 1 million Kruger cannot compare to potentially getting rid of the fold. I never understood that side of the story. Like, I understand he's a criminal, he's only out for himself, blah blah blah, but the stakes were just on such a different level that I never really bought into their mission. So each time we were kind of asked to follow them on this journey, whilst I enjoyed it because the characters have charisma, they have a great team dynamic, I think overall the plot just felt so superfluous, so dumb. Just on a completely different level to what we were actually dealing with when it came to the character of Alina. But I feel like when it comes to the character of Inej, she very much helped to bring things into perspective. First of all, because her motivations weren't just to get rich, but she actually wanted to get her freedom because she was essentially a slave, which I appreciated the fact that that was what motivated her. And also we do have that interesting angle of her character being quite like religious. She's a person of the faith. That's another thing that Game of Thrones kind of touches on, that this series does to a lesser extent, but she is a person of the faith, and she sees the Sun Summoner as a saint. And also she has these different, you know, morals when it comes to killing people, although that kind of is let go of a little bit by the end of the series because you need to do what needs to be done. But yeah, that's why I enjoyed this character a bit more. She just had more layers to her in comparison to Kaz and especially Jesper. And again, when it comes to my ordering of these characters, next up would be Kaz. I was actually very impressed with the character of Kaz because I kept expecting him to kind of loosen up. I kept expecting him to kind of loosen up, but no, the whole time he was very staunch, very strict, very focused on his mission, and I have to give him credit for that, even though I do think that his focus was misguided, because getting 1 million Kruger versus saving the world seems seems illogical to me. But anyways, he had a mission and he very much stuck to it. He was also very much the brains of the operation. I could see how someone like him had become so successful in the underbelly of their society. So I liked the the portrayal of the character of Kaz, although again my issue was the mission overall and how it just didn't make sense with the overall scale of what was at stake. I also very much enjoyed his relationship with Inej and him really trying to gain her freedom back and making promises to her that he intended to keep. I was less convinced by his relationship with Jesper, because yes, Jesper is right below, like right down below, with a substantial place in between the other two. I don't see what he adds to the group. I don't see what he seems like more of a nuisance. I know that he gets stuff done, but the detours, and I know it's supposed to be comedic relief, but the whole time I was like, okay, great, you're on this mission to get rich off of a horrible situation. Okay, fine, I'm being asked to back that up. But now I'm also being asked to go along with you going on every single detour, hooking up with random people, you know, giving us the kind of HBO Game of Thrones effect of these sex scenes, whilst at the same time going gambling with the money that was given to... Like, how were we not expected to just be so frustrated with Jesper? And especially when you have a character like Kaz who seems so efficient and so focused. I have no idea how Jesper is still on his team, like how he can still stand the sight of him. I would be so annoyed. Even if he gets results done, there are many people who would get those same results, but in a far more streamlined way. And again, he's supposed to be this kind of comedic relief and this kind of extra lovable rogue, so you're supposed to forgive him for all of his misgivings. But I don't think he was actually as lovable as he thought he was. And also there was a slight issue where in one scene they're supposed to be in disguise as these other travelers who are supposed to get on the boat that Alina is on. And in the fake ID that Kaz gets for him, he's supposed to be like a certain age, and he's like, you know, I don't look that age, like I look way younger. And I'm like, yeah, you do look you look way younger. I don't know what age he was supposed to be, but obviously he was miscast for that particular scene, because no way would we be convinced that this character, this actor, would be concerned about how old he looked. Like, he looks my age. And finally, when it comes to the different storylines that are explored in this season, I did want to touch on Nina and Matthias and their little, you know, D storyline that takes place off to the side. When it comes to Matthias, the culture of the people that he's supposed to come from very much feels a bit more Germanic as opposed to Russian. And I do think that it's interesting that we explore this character who's been brainwashed by his culture and his society. He very much upholds these sexist views of women. And we're also touching on, you know, the views of promiscuous women and women who are called witches historically in real life, and how that would tie into his upbringing and how he sees the Grisha. So I do think it was an interesting angle for that character. And when it came to their interactions, seeing him kind of try and break down some of those walls that have been so thoroughly erected in his brain when it comes to the brainwashing that he's had surrounding Grisha was a really nice kind of touching love story. I mean, I don't know if it was necessary. I don't know if we needed it, but it was there and I enjoyed their scenes together. I do think that they had a nice chemistry there. And of course, that moment where he gets betrayed by Nina and her Grisha people, okay? When the people from the Little Palace come to get her, they end up taking him away, and she has to kind of accuse him of being a slaver in order to basically save his life, because the alternative is worse. But he's headed towards some sort of prison of some sort. So I guess he's not feeling quite as forgiving towards her as she wants him to be, and ultimately the trust that was built between these two characters is broken as a result of Nina kind of betraying him. So overall, as I've already said, I think the comparisons that this series gets to Game of Thrones are completely unfounded. Okay, they're just two separate things. I think in the case of Shadow and Bone, we don't have that same layer of complexity there. We don't have the intricacy of the world building with each of these different pockets of the world feeling very distinct, the cultures being, you know, beautifully crafted, and the histories being beautifully crafted. Like, we don't have that in the case of Shadow and Bone. And also at the forefront of the story, we have the special, we have, you know, the chosen one archetype. And so it very much follows a lot of fantasy series in that way. It doesn't feel particularly distinct in that way, but at the same time, like I said, I did appreciate the fact that we're using different reference points when it comes to the backdrop of the series. It feeling more Russian, okay? It feeling like a different kind of fantasy series in that way. But at the same time, a lot of the same fantasy tropes that we've seen time and time again are played out here, as well as a lot of the same Netflix tropes that we've seen time and time again. And when it comes to Netflix series, it's tough because I feel like, once again, this is kind of on the upper end of Netflix fantasy series. Like, we're approaching like a The Witcher kind of end, as opposed to The Irregulars and Letter for the King. I cannot stress this enough. Like, those lot, okay, we're more towards The Witcher on this one. But I will say, when it comes to Netflix, there is always this restriction because Netflix doesn't really have an incentive to do more. They don't really have an incentive to do better, because all they want you to do is keep subscribing to their platform. They want to keep you on there. And so they see this, recognizable IP, and they think, great, we're going to get a bunch of teenagers to subscribe or say subscribed for the next month, and they'll be talking about it for about a week until we move on to the next thing. So there's never really an incentive to create something as grand as Game of Thrones, even though this series does demonstrate the potential, okay, and the production value ish to do so. So that's why overall, having watched some of these series, I am starting to notice, these common issues, these common tropes throughout Netflix series specifically, that aren't really going to be corrected because Netflix doesn't really have to. As long as you stay subscribed, that's all they really care about. But at the same time, I will say, when it comes to their entries into the fantasy genre, this is one of their better efforts. And so with all of that being said, I'm going to be giving Shadow and Bone a 7.5 out of 10. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on Shadow and Bone, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this series down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!